I drove 6 hours on Christmas Eve to watch my family destroy themselves. And honestly, it was worth every mile. Look, I need to give you some context here because this is going to sound insane without it. 5 years ago, when I was 23, I made what my family considered an unforgivable mistake. I got arrested for possession with intent to distribute. Yeah, not my finest moment. I was young, stupid, and hanging out with the wrong people. The charges got reduced to simple possession because I legitimately didn't know my roommate was dealing out of our apartment, but the damage was done. I called my dad from the holding cell, terrified and asking for help with bail. He hung up on me. My mom texted me that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings until I got my life together. My sister Maeve posted on Facebook about how embarrassing it was to have a criminal for a brother. My brother Kyle told everyone at his work that I didn't exist anymore. They cut me off completely. No financial help, no emotional support, nothing. I spent 3 days in jail before a public defender got me out. I lost my job, my apartment, and pretty much everything I owned. I was sleeping in my 2008 Ford Ranger, showering at the gym, and working whatever day labor I could find. My family knew all of this. They didn't care. When I tried reaching out to my Uncle Hank, he told me I had made my bed and needed to lie in it. My grandma Catherine actually told people at church that she prayed for my soul because I had chosen a life of sin. Here's the thing though, I'm not some pathetic victim in this story. I got angry, sure, but I channeled that anger into something productive. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously. I saved every dollar. I took online courses at the community college. I networked with people in my industry. And over 5 years, I built myself back up. I'm now 28, making decent money in logistics management, living in a nice apartment in a different city, and I've been clean since that arrest. No drugs, barely even drink. I rebuilt my entire life while my family pretended I didn't exist. But here's what you need to understand about my family. They're not just cold. They're vicious. They derive genuine pleasure from tearing people down. My dad, Caleb, is a regional manager at a manufacturing plant, and he treats everyone around him like they're beneath him. My mom, Skylar, is a stay-at-home wife who spends her time gossiping with other moms and judging people. Maeve works in retail and acts like she's the CEO of the universe. Kyle is in middle management somewhere and thinks he's hot stuff because he wears a tie to work. Uncle Hank owns a small construction business and never shuts up about how he's a self-made man. And Grandma Catherine, well, she's the matriarch who set the tone for this whole toxic dynamic. They all live within 20 minutes of each other in the same town I grew up in. They have family dinners every week. They celebrate every holiday together. And for 5 years, I watched their Facebook posts and Instagram stories showing their perfect little family unit without me in it. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving. They made sure to tag each other and comment about how blessed they were to have such a wonderful family. The message was clear. I was the black sheep who ruined the family reputation, and they were better off without me. I could have let it go. I could have moved on and built a new life without them. But every time I thought about that phone call from jail, about my dad's voice telling me I was on my own, about my mom's text saying I was an embarrassment, about my sister's Facebook post calling me a criminal, something inside me just stayed angry. I didn't want to forgive them. I didn't want reconciliation. I wanted them to understand what they had done, and I wanted them to pay for it. So over the past 2 years, I've been carefully planning. I kept tabs on all of them through social media and mutual acquaintances who didn't know about our falling out. I knew where they worked, where they lived, what their routines were. I knew my parents were still living in the same house I grew up in, the one they'd owned for 30 years. I knew Maeve was renting an apartment downtown. I knew Kyle had just bought his first house with his wife. I knew Uncle Hank's business had been struggling lately, but he was too proud to admit it. I knew Grandma Catherine lived in a senior apartment complex that my parents helped pay for. 3 months ago, I sent them all a group text from a new number they wouldn't recognize. Simple message. I'll be home for Christmas. Hope you're all there. They didn't respond. I don't know if they even knew it was me, but I knew they'd all be at my parents' house on Christmas Eve like they were every year. That's how predictable they are. I showed up at 6 p.m. The house was lit up with those tacky inflatable decorations my mom loves. I could hear laughter and Christmas music from inside. I had a wrapped gift box with me. Nothing expensive, just something I picked up. I rang the doorbell and waited. My dad opened the door. The look on his face when he recognized me was something I'll remember forever. Not happiness, not relief, just pure disdain. He looked me up and down, taking in my clean jeans and decent jacket, and then he looked past me at my truck parked on the street. The failure returns. Still driving that rusted heap? Or did you finally lose that too? His voice was loud enough for everyone inside to hear. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The whole family was there in the living room, just like I knew they would be. My mom stood up from the couch and immediately backed away from me like I might steal something. Don't touch anything. We know how things disappear around you. Her tone was exactly what I expected. That same passive-aggressive nastiness she'd perfected over the years. Maeve actually laughed. She was holding a glass of wine and she raised it toward me like a toast. Hide your wallets, everyone. The leech is back. A few of them actually chuckled at that. Kyle was sitting in Dad's recliner, and he leaned forward with this smug expression. Remember when he begged Dad for bail money? Pathetic. He shook his head like I was some kind of cautionary tale. Uncle Hank was by the fireplace with a beer in his hand. He pointed at me with the bottle. Some stains never wash out, no matter how hard you scrub. More laughter. And then Grandma Catherine, sitting in her usual spot by the window, just cackled. Even the dog knows better than to trust him. Their golden retriever was literally wagging its tail at me, but nobody seemed to notice or care about the irony. They all thought this was hilarious. My entire family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, were laughing at me in unison like I was entertainment. I stood there in the entryway with snow melting off my boots, holding a wrapped present, while they competed to see who could be the cruelest. I let them have their moment. I let them get it all out. And when they finally stopped laughing, I walked over to the coffee table, set down the gift, and said, "Merry Christmas." Then I turned around and walked out. I didn't slam the door, I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just left. The text started about 20 minutes later while I was driving to the hotel I'd booked. My mom first, asking where I was going. Then Maeve, saying I couldn't just leave like that. Then Kyle, telling me I was being dramatic. I didn't respond to any of them. By midnight, my phone had 43 missed calls. By Christmas morning, I had over 100 text messages across multiple family group chats they'd added me to. The messages were changing in tone. Less mockery, more confusion. Where are you? We need to talk to you. This isn't funny. Call us back. What did you do? That last question was the one that kept repeating. What did you do? What did you do? What did you do? I still haven't responded. I'm writing this from my hotel room, watching my phone blow up with increasingly desperate messages. My dad called me 17 times in the past hour. My mom sent a voice message where she was actually crying, begging me to answer. Maeve sent me a long text about how family forgives family and we need to work through this together. Kyle tried contacting me through LinkedIn, of all places. They opened the gift, obviously. I'm sure they're losing their minds right now trying to figure out what it means. I'm sure they're calling each other, comparing notes, trying to piece together what I've done. The thing is, I've had 5 years to plan this, 5 years to prepare, 5 years to make sure that when this moment came, I would be ready and they would have absolutely no idea what hit them. And judging by the messages I'm reading right now, they really truly have no idea. But they're starting to figure it out. Update 1. Okay, so I need to address the elephant in the room first because I know you're all wondering what was in the gift. And yeah, shout out to the commenter who guessed it was paperwork. You were half right. Inside that wrapped box was a binder. A thick, organized, color-coded binder with tabs and printed documents and bank statements. The cover page said, "Merry Christmas, a 5-year summary." And look, I wish I could have seen their faces when they opened it, but honestly, the messages I got afterward painted a pretty clear picture. But let me back up because I'm getting ahead of myself, and you need the full context of what happened on Christmas Day and the day after. Trust me, it gets so much worse before it gets better. I woke up Christmas morning to 247 unread messages. Not exaggerating. I counted. My phone had basically become a bomb of notifications that I'd been ignoring since I left their house. I ordered room service, sat in bed, and started reading through everything they'd sent me during the night. The early messages were still angry and confused. Dad demanding I come back and explain myself. Mom saying I had embarrassed them in front of the whole family. Maeve calling me immature for walking out. Kyle saying I always had to make everything about me. Standard stuff from them, honestly. But then around 3 a.m., the messages changed. Someone had opened the gift. And suddenly every single member of my family was losing their minds in different ways. Mom sent me a voice message where she was actually hyperventilating, asking me what I had done, begging me to call her. Dad sent a text in all caps that just said, "We need to talk now." Maeve sent me about 15 messages in a row, each one more panicked than the last, asking if this was real, asking if I was serious, asking what I wanted from them. Kyle tried calling me 38 times between 4 and 6 a.m. Uncle Hank sent me a long rambling text about family loyalty and how I had crossed a line. Even Grandma Catherine, who barely knows how to use her phone, managed to send me a text saying I needed to reconsider what I was doing. I didn't respond to any of them. I had breakfast, took a long shower, and went to the hotel gym. My phone kept buzzing in my pocket the entire time. I could feel it vibrating with every call and text, and I just let it happen. This was part of the plan. Let them panic. Let them spiral. Let them realize that I wasn't the same desperate kid who called from jail 5 years ago. Around noon, I finally sent a group text to all of them. One sentence. I'll meet you at the house at 4 p.m. Be there. The responses were immediate and frantic. Dad said he'd be there. Mom said they all would. Maeve asked if I was going to explain everything. Kyle demanded I tell them what I wanted. I didn't reply again. Just let them stew in it for a few more hours. I showed up at exactly 4 p.m. on Christmas Day. My entire family was already there, sitting in the living room like they were waiting for a funeral to start. The Christmas decorations looked ridiculous now. All those twinkling lights and fake cheers surrounding what was about to happen. Dad was standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed. Mom was on the couch wringing her hands. Maeve was pacing by the window. Kyle sat in the recliner looking like he wanted to punch something. Uncle Hank stood near the kitchen doorway. Grandma Catherine was in her usual spot, but she wasn't smiling anymore. The binder was on the coffee table. They'd clearly been through it multiple times. Pages were bent, tabs were messed up, and there were sticky notes everywhere. I sat down in the chair across from them and waited. Nobody said anything for a solid minute. They were all just staring at me like they couldn't figure out how to start this conversation. Finally, Dad spoke up. He wanted to know if the information in that binder was accurate. He wanted to know if I had really done what the document suggested. He wanted to know what the hell I thought I was doing. I told him everything in that binder was completely accurate, and I had receipts for all of it. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, signed agreements, the whole 9 yards. I'd been meticulous about documenting everything because I knew this moment would come eventually. Mom jumped in then, asking me why I would do something like this. She wanted to know what I was trying to accomplish. She said this wasn't the son she raised, that I had become vindictive and cruel. I actually laughed at that. I asked her which son she raised exactly because the son she raised got abandoned in jail and had to rebuild his entire life alone. I asked her if she remembered texting me that I was an embarrassment. I asked her if she remembered 5 years of family holidays without me. I asked her if she remembered any of that before she decided to lecture me about being cruel. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Dad. They both just sat there looking at me like I was a stranger. Maeve tried a different approach. She said that what happened 5 years ago was wrong, that they all handled it badly, that they should have been there for me. But she said this wasn't the way to handle it now. She said family should forgive and move forward, not destroy each other over old wounds. I asked Maeve if she remembered posting on Facebook about how embarrassing it was to have a criminal for a brother. I asked her if she remembered laughing about me with her friends. I asked her if she thought a simple apology now was supposed to make 5 years of abandonment okay. She said people make mistakes and hold grudges forever isn't healthy. She said I was being unreasonable. Kyle was getting angrier by the second. He stood up and started demanding to know exactly what I wanted. He said I clearly had some kind of agenda bringing that binder to their house. He said I obviously wanted something from them or I wouldn't have come back at all. He told me to stop playing games and just tell them what my demands were. I told Kyle I didn't have demands. I told him this wasn't a negotiation. I told him that everything laid out in that binder was already in motion and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. That's when Uncle Hank spoke up. He said I was bluffing. He said there was no way I could have done half the things documented in that binder without them knowing. He said I was probably exaggerating or lying to scare them, and that I should think very carefully about what accusations I was making. I pulled out my phone and showed him bank statements. Real ones from real accounts, showing real transactions. I showed him dates, amounts, and reference numbers. I watched his face go pale as he realized I wasn't bluffing about anything. See, here's what that binder contained and what I'd actually done over the past 5 years. While my family was busy pretending I didn't exist and posting about their perfect life on social media, I was quietly becoming involved in their finances in ways they never noticed. Grandma Catherine's senior apartment, the one she's been living in for the past 4 years, my parents told everyone they were covering her rent because she couldn't afford it on her fixed income. That was true initially, but about 3 years ago, my parents started struggling with their own bills, and they quietly stopped paying the full amount. The apartment complex was going to evict her. I found out through a friend who works in property management in their area. So I set up an anonymous payment system through a property management company I contracted with for work. For 3 years, I've been covering 60% of Grandma's rent without anyone knowing. The apartment complex thinks it's coming from some kind of charity fund my parents set up. My parents think the complex gave Grandma a discount. Uncle Hank's construction business? The one he won't shut up about being self-made? He almost lost it 2 years ago when he couldn't make payroll for 3 months straight. He was going to have to file bankruptcy. I had connections in logistics and I funneled several contracts his way through third-party companies. Legitimate work, competitive bids, but I made sure his company was always in the right place at the right time to get those jobs. Those contracts kept him afloat. He thought he was just finally getting lucky after a rough patch. Kyle and his new house? He barely qualified for that mortgage. His debt-to-income ratio was terrible because he's been living above his means for years. I found out through a mutual friend that his mortgage application was going to be denied. So I paid off one of his credit cards anonymously, routing it through a debt relief program that made it look like a settlement. It improved his credit score just enough for the mortgage to go through. He thought the credit card company just wrote off his debt. And my parents? Their perfect little house they've owned for 30 years? They refinanced it 4 years ago to pay for Maeve's wedding and some other expenses. They got a variable rate mortgage because the payments were lower, initially. But when rates went up, they started drowning. They were facing foreclosure about 18 months ago. I bought the debt from their lender through an LLC I set up. Then I restructured it as an investment property agreement where they're technically renting from my LLC while having an option to buy it back. They think they're working with some investment company that gave them a special deal. They have no idea I own the paperwork on their house. The binder laid all of this out. Every transaction, every contract, every payment. Proof that I had been the one keeping their lives together while they treated me like garbage. Dad's face went through about 5 different emotions while I was explaining this. He asked me why I would do any of that if I hated them so much. He asked me what the point was of helping them secretly. I told him the point was that I wanted them to owe me everything. I wanted to be the reason they still had their comfortable lives. I wanted them to realize that the failure, the criminal, the embarrassment they disowned had become the only thing holding their family together. And I wanted to be able to take it all away whenever I felt like it. Mom started crying then. Real tears. Not the fake ones she uses to manipulate people. She said I couldn't do this to them. She said it was cruel and vindictive, and that I was destroying the family. I reminded her that they destroyed our family 5 years ago, when they abandoned me. I told her I was just finishing what they started. Maeve tried bargaining that. She asked what they could do to fix this. She asked if there was any way to make things right. She said they'd apologize properly, that they'd include me in the family again, that they'd make up for lost time. I told her it was too late for apologies. I told her I didn't want to be part of their family anymore. I told her I just wanted them to understand what they'd done and to suffer the consequences. Kyle lost it at that point. He started yelling that I couldn't just pull the rug out from under all of them over something that happened 5 years ago. He said I was being psychotic and that I needed to grow up. He said they made one mistake and I was acting like they'd tried to murder me. One mistake. That's what he called 5 years of complete abandonment. One mistake. I stood up to leave. I told them the binder had all the information they needed about what was going to happen next. I told them they had 30 days before various things started to unravel. I told them to read it carefully. Dad blocked the doorway. He said I wasn't leaving until we figured this out. He said we were family, and we needed to work through this like adults. He actually tried to put his hand on my shoulder. I stepped back and told him if he touched me, I'd call the police. I told him he stopped being my father when he hung up on me from jail. I told him he had no right to call me family now. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like forever. Eventually, he moved out of the way. I walked to my truck and drove back to the hotel. My phone started exploding again within minutes. But this time the messages were different. They were trying every tactic they could think of. Dad was threatening legal action. Mom was begging and guilting. Maeve was trying to reason and negotiate. Kyle was raging and insulting. Uncle Hank was trying to call my bluff. Grandma Catherine sent me a message saying I was breaking her heart. But here's the thing. I meant what I said about 30 days. The binder outlined exactly what would happen when I withdrew my support. Grandma would get an eviction notice. Uncle Hank would lose his contracts. Kyle's mortgage would go into default because I'd also been anonymously covering some of his property taxes, and my parents would discover they don't actually own their house anymore, and their rent is about to increase substantially. I'm back in my own city now. It's been 2 days since Christmas. My family has called me 412 times. They've sent over 1,000 text messages. They've tried to reach me through old friends, former coworkers, anyone they think might have my ear. And yesterday, Uncle Hank showed up at my apartment building. I don't know how he found my address, but he was in the lobby, demanding to talk to me. Building security removed him. This is spiraling faster than I expected. Update 2. Alright, so it's been 12 days since Christmas and I need to update you all because this situation has become way more complicated than I anticipated. And before anyone asks, yes, I'm still going through with everything. No, I haven't forgiven them. And no, I don't feel guilty. Just wanted to get that out of the way first because I know some of you were worried I'd cave under pressure. The pressure has been intense, by the way. My family has basically made harassing me their full-time job, but they've gotten smarter about it, which is honestly more annoying than when they were just panic calling me 400 times a day. So here's what's been happening. About a week ago, the messages and calls suddenly stopped. Complete radio silence for about 36 hours. I actually thought maybe they'd accepted defeat or were planning to just deal with the consequences. Yeah, I was wrong about that. What they were actually doing was regrouping and coming up with a strategy. And I have to give them credit, they're not as stupid as I thought they'd be when faced with losing everything. Kyle's wife, Noah, got involved. I barely know Noah because she married Kyle, after I'd already been cut off from the family, so we've maybe met twice in passing at public places over the years. She's some kind of financial analyst or accountant or something. I don't know exactly, but she's apparently good with numbers and contracts. Noah showed up at my workplace, my actual office. I don't know how she found out where I work, but she walked right into the reception area and asked to speak with me. I came down to the lobby and there she was, dressed in business casual, carrying a briefcase like she was there for a meeting. She said she wanted to talk about the situation with my family. She said she understood I was angry and had valid reasons, but that Kyle had been stressed to the point of getting physically sick, and she needed to understand exactly what was going to happen to their mortgage. She wasn't crying or begging. She was treating this like a business negotiation. I told her that wasn't my problem. I told her Kyle had laughed at me when I was at my lowest point, and that he should have thought about his wife and his mortgage before deciding to mock someone who'd asked for help from jail. Noah said she understood that, but she wasn't part of what happened 5 years ago. She said she had nothing to do with how my family treated me, and it wasn't fair for her to lose her house over something she didn't participate in. She said Kyle had told her some of what happened back then, and while she didn't think he handled it well, she didn't think destroying their financial stability was proportional to the offense. I asked her what Kyle had told her exactly about 5 years ago. I wanted to know what version of events he'd shared with his wife. She said Kyle told her I'd gotten arrested for drugs and called asking for bail money, and that my dad refused because he was trying to teach me a lesson about responsibility. She said Kyle admitted the family probably should have helped me more afterward, but that I'd also made choices that led to the arrest in the first place. So Kyle had spun it as tough love instead of complete abandonment. Interesting. I told Noah the full story. I told her about sleeping in my truck for 6 months. I told her about the 3 jobs I worked simultaneously. I told her about the Facebook posts and the complete shunning and the 5 years of family gatherings where they celebrated not having me around. I told her about showing up on Christmas Eve and being mocked by every single person in that house. Noah listened to all of it. Then she asked me what I wanted to happen now. She said if this was about making them understand what they did, I'd accomplished that. She said everyone in the family was fully aware now that they'd treated me horribly and that they'd been dependent on my help without knowing it. She said if I wanted them to suffer financially, I could do that. But she wanted to know what the end goal was because destroying them wouldn't undo the past 5 years. I told her the end goal was for them to lose the things they valued more than they valued me. I told her they prioritized their reputation, their comfortable lives, and their perfect family image over their own son and brother. So now they were going to lose those things and understand what it feels like to have nothing. Noah said that was fair enough, but asked if I'd considered that this would also hurt people like her who had nothing to do with the original situation. She said Kyle's parents would lose their house. Her mother-in-law would be devastated. Grandma Catherine would be homeless. Uncle Hank's employees would lose their jobs if his business failed. I told her collateral damage wasn't my responsibility. I told her she married into this family knowing what kind of people they were. She said actually she didn't know what kind of people they were because Kyle had hidden the whole situation with me. She said she'd been married to Kyle for 3 years and didn't even know he had a brother until about 6 months ago when she saw an old family photo and asked who I was. She said Kyle told her I'd had addiction problems and had cut contact with the family years ago to focus on recovery. That genuinely surprised me. Kyle had completely erased me from his life to the point where his own wife didn't know I existed. Noah said she was telling me this because she wanted me to understand that whatever revenge I was planning, I should make sure it was actually hitting the people responsible. She said if I wanted Kyle to suffer, there were ways to do that without destroying their mortgage. She said if I wanted my parents to understand what they'd done, there were ways to make that happen without making Grandma Catherine homeless. Then she left, just like that, handed me her business card, said to contact her if I wanted to discuss options, and walked out. I went back to my office and spent the rest of the day thinking about that conversation. Because Noah had a point that I didn't want to admit. My revenge was going to hurt a lot of people who weren't in that living room 5 years ago. Uncle Hank's employees had nothing to do with anything. Kyle's wife had been lied to about my existence. Grandma Catherine, as toxic as she is, is still an 82-year-old woman who would actually be on the street if I went through with this. But here's the thing that kept me angry. Every single one of them knew what they were doing on Christmas Eve. Grandma Catherine cackled about the dog not trusting me. Uncle Hank talked about stains that don't wash out. They all participated in humiliating me as a group. They all laughed together at my expense. So I don't really care if some of them would face homelessness. They didn't care when I was sleeping in my truck. Anyway, Noah's visit was just the opening move. 2 days later, my parents showed up at my apartment. Not at the building, but somehow they got past the security door, probably by following another resident in, and they were standing in the hallway outside my actual apartment door when I got home from the gym. Dad wanted to talk face-to-face without any more texts or intermediaries. Mom kept saying we needed to have a real conversation as a family. I almost called the police right there, but decided to hear them out. I let them into my apartment. They sat on my couch and looked around at my place like they were seeing evidence of an alien life form. I've got a nice 2-bedroom in a decent building. Nothing fancy but comfortable. I could tell they were processing the fact that I'd rebuilt my life without them. Mom started with an apology. A real one this time, not the performative stuff from before. She said she'd spent the past week thinking about that phone call from jail and about how scared I must have been. She said she'd spent 5 years justifying their decision by telling herself they were teaching me a lesson, but that she'd been lying to herself. She said there was no excuse for what they'd done and that she was deeply sorry. Dad took longer to get there, but eventually, he said that he'd reacted out of embarrassment and anger 5 years ago. He said he'd been so focused on what people would think about his son getting arrested that he didn't consider what I was actually going through. He said the family had always valued reputation and appearances, and that when I got arrested, he saw it as a stain on the family name that needed to be cut out. He said he'd convinced himself that tough love was the right approach and that I'd come back eventually after learning my lesson. I asked him if he thought 5 years of radio silence was teaching me a lesson, or if it was just easier to pretend I didn't exist. He didn't have an answer for that. Mom said they wanted to make things right. She said they'd include me in everything going forward, that they'd publicly acknowledge what they did wrong, that they'd support me however I needed. She said family should stick together and that they wanted me back in their lives. I asked her where this desire for family unity was when I was working 3 jobs and living in my truck. I asked her if she'd felt this urgent need for reconciliation at any point during the past 5 years, or if it only mattered now that their house was at stake. She admitted it was the crisis that made them realize what they'd lost. She said sometimes people don't appreciate what they have until it's gone. I told her that was exactly the lesson I'd been trying to teach them. Dad pivoted then. He said fine, they deserved consequences. But did the consequences have to be this extreme? He said losing their house, destroying Uncle Hank's business, making Grandma homeless. It was all too much. He said I'd made my point and now we needed to figure out a path forward that didn't leave everyone destitute. I asked him what path forward he'd figured out when I was destitute 5 years ago. We went in circles like this for about 2 hours. They'd try different angles. Guilt, apologies, bargaining, appealing to my sense of family, pointing out collateral damage. I kept throwing their own actions back at them. Eventually, Dad said they'd been talking to someone about the LLC, the property agreements I'd set up. He said they had questions about the legality of some of the arrangements. He said they weren't threatening legal action necessarily, but they wanted to understand their options. That was when I knew they'd been consulting with lawyers. They were trying to find a way out of this that didn't involve actual apologies or consequences. I told them the arrangements were completely legal. I told them I'd had everything reviewed by multiple attorneys when I set it up, because I knew this day would come eventually. I told them they could spend money on lawyers if they wanted, but it wouldn't change anything. Mom started crying again. She said I'd become someone she didn't recognize. She said the son she raised wouldn't do something this cruel. I reminded her that the son she raised died in a jail cell when his father hung up on him. I told her she was talking to someone else now, someone who'd learned that family is conditional and that love comes with terms and conditions. They left after that. Dad looked defeated in a way I'd never seen before. Mom was still crying. That was 4 days ago. Since then, Maeve has been trying a different approach. She's been sending me long messages about specific memories from when we were kids, trips we took, games we played, inside jokes we had. She's trying to remind me that we had good times once, that we meant something to each other before everything went wrong. The problem is that I remember all of those things too, and I remember how quickly she abandoned them when it became inconvenient to have me as a brother. Uncle Hank lost another contract yesterday. Not one I had anything to do with, just regular business stuff, but it's making his situation worse. He sent me a message saying his business was going under and that 15 people were going to lose their jobs if I didn't reverse what I'd done. He said I had a chance to be better than them, to show mercy where they'd shown none. I don't want to show mercy. I want them to understand what they did. The 30-day deadline is in 18 days. Grandma's rent is due. Uncle Hank's employees need to be paid. Kyle's mortgage payment is coming up. My parents' rent to my LLC is increasing. Everything is converging, and my family is running out of time to find solutions. And I'm sitting here in my apartment watching it all happen. Still angry after 5 years, still wanting them to suffer, but also realizing that Noah was right about collateral damage. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Final update. It's been 34 days since Christmas, and I'm writing this final update because people have been asking what happened. The short version is that I went through with it, all of it, and my family is exactly where I wanted them to be. Let me walk you through what happened as the deadline approached and then passed, because it was honestly more satisfying than I'd imagined it would be over the past 5 years of planning this. The week before the 30-day deadline, my family organized what they called a family intervention. They didn't ask if I'd come. They just told me they'd all be at a restaurant downtown at 6 p.m. on a Thursday and that I needed to be there. The restaurant was one of those chain places with big booths and loud music, the kind where you can have a conversation without everyone around you hearing. I showed up because I wanted to see this. All of them were already there when I arrived. Mom, Dad, Maeve, Kyle, Noah, Uncle Hank, and even Grandma Catherine, who I guess they'd driven into the city specifically for this meeting. They'd pushed 2 tables together and had clearly been there for a while based on the drinks already on the table. Dad started by saying they'd been doing a lot of thinking and talking among themselves. He said they'd come to understand that what they did 5 years ago was unforgivable, that they'd failed me as a family, and that they took full responsibility for their actions. He said they weren't making excuses anymore, and they weren't trying to minimize what they'd done. Mom jumped in and said they'd also been discussing how to make amends in a real way, not just with words. She said they wanted to set up a family fund to pay me back for the 3 years I'd been secretly supporting everyone. She said they'd calculated that I'd spent roughly $80,000 on various payments and contracts, and they wanted to figure out a payment plan to reimburse me. Maeve said they'd also talked about public acknowledgement. She said if I wanted them to post on social media about what they'd done, explaining how they'd abandoned me, and then discovered I'd been supporting them anyway, they would do that. She said they understood that their reputation in the community mattered to them, and if I wanted to damage that reputation as part of my revenge, they wouldn't fight it. Kyle said he'd told Noah everything now, the full truth about what happened 5 years ago and how they'd treated me. He said Noah had made him realize that he'd been complicit in something horrible, and that his behavior on Christmas Eve was inexcusable. He said he was prepared to face whatever consequences I felt were appropriate. Uncle Hank was more direct. He said his business was going under regardless of what I did at this point, that he'd lost too many contracts and couldn't make payroll. He said he'd already started the process of closing down and that his employees knew they'd need to find other work. He said if that was the consequence I wanted him to face, then fine. But he wanted me to know that he understood why. Grandma Catherine didn't say much. She just sat there looking smaller than I remembered, not cackling anymore, just old and tired. I listened to all of this, and then I asked them what they thought was going to happen here. I asked if they really believed an apology and an offer to pay me back would make 5 years of abandonment okay. Dad said no, they didn't think it would make it okay, but they hoped it would be a starting point for rebuilding some kind of relationship. He said they weren't asking for immediate forgiveness, just for a chance to prove they'd changed. I told them they hadn't changed. I told them the only thing that had changed was their circumstances. I told them they were sitting here offering apologies and restitution because they were facing consequences, not because they'd actually realized what they'd done was wrong. I told them if I'd never come back on Christmas Eve, if I just stayed away forever, they would have continued living their comfortable lives talking about their wonderful family without ever thinking about me. Maeve tried to argue that wasn't true, that they'd thought about me over the years, that they'd wondered how I was doing. I asked her if she'd thought about me while she was posting those perfect family photos on Instagram. I asked her if she'd wondered how I was doing while she was celebrating holidays together. I asked her why. In 5 years, not one of them had tried to reach out even once to see if I was alive. Nobody had an answer for that. Noah spoke up then. She said she'd been reviewing all the contracts and agreements I'd set up, and she'd confirmed with legal counsel that everything was airtight. She said there was no way to challenge the LLC ownership or the restructured agreements without proving fraud. And since everything I'd done was technically legitimate, there was no fraud to prove. She said she was telling me this so everyone at the table understood that there was no legal way out of this situation. She said the family had 2 options. Option 1 was to try to meet my terms, whatever those terms were, and hope I'd restructure the agreements to something manageable. Option 2 was to accept the consequences and figure out how to rebuild from nothing, the same way I'd had to do 5 years ago. I appreciated Noah's directness. She was the only one being realistic about the situation. I told them I'd already decided what was going to happen and that this dinner wasn't a negotiation. I told them the deadline had passed 2 days ago and things were already in motion. Mom asked what I meant by things were already in motion. Her hands were shaking when she reached for her water glass. I explained that Grandma Catherine's apartment complex had already been notified that the payments would stop. I said she had 30 days from that notification to either pay the back rent herself or vacate. I said that was about 28 days from now. I explained that Uncle Hank's contracts had already been terminated by my logistics contacts. I said his business would be closed within the month and his employees had already been given notice. I said I'd actually helped place some of his better workers with other companies because they didn't deserve to suffer for his actions. I explained that Kyle's mortgage was going to get a notice about the property tax situation within the next week. I said once the bank discovered that the anonymous payments had stopped, they'd move to protect their investment, which meant Kyle would need to prove he could cover those payments himself or face default proceedings. And I explained that my parents' house situation was the most complicated. I said the LLC I'd created had officially converted their property agreement from a rent-to-own situation to a standard rental agreement with market rate pricing. I said their monthly payment was going to triple starting next month. I said they could either pay it, which they couldn't afford, or they could move out. I said if they chose to move out, I'd be selling the house they'd lived in for 30 years to the highest bidder. Dad's face went completely pale. He asked if I was seriously going to make my own parents homeless. He asked if I understood what I was doing to them. I told him I understood perfectly. I told him I was doing to them exactly what they'd done to me 5 years ago, taking away their security, their comfort, their sense of home, and their family support system. I told him the only difference was that they'd done it to a 23-year-old kid who'd made a mistake, and I was doing it to adults who'd made a deliberate choice to be cruel. Mom started crying properly then. Not the manipulative tears from before, but actual sobbing. She asked me what she was supposed to do, where they were supposed to go. She said they didn't have savings to cover a move or deposits on a new place. She said they'd used everything to maintain their lifestyle over the years. I told her that sounded like a personal problem. I told her she'd figure it out the same way I'd figured it out when I was sleeping in my truck. Maeve stood up and said I'd made my point, that I'd proven I could hurt them, and now I needed to decide if I wanted to be the kind of person who actually went through with destroying his entire family. She said revenge might feel good in the moment, but that I'd regret this for the rest of my life. She said family was supposed to forgive each other, and that I was throwing away any chance of ever having a relationship with them again. I told Maeve I'd already thrown away our relationship 5 years ago when I realized what kind of people they actually were. I told her this wasn't about revenge feeling good, it was about consequences. I told her they'd spent 5 years acting like I didn't exist, and now they were going to spend however many years dealing with the consequences of that choice. Kyle lost his temper then. He stood up and said, I was being a vindictive psychopath who was punishing people beyond anything reasonable. He said what they did was bad, but what I was doing was worse. He said at least they'd abandoned me emotionally, but I was actually destroying their lives financially and making them homeless. He said I was the villain in this situation now, and that he hoped I understood that. I asked Kyle if he thought being homeless was worse than being emotionally abandoned. I asked him if he'd ever spent a winter living in a vehicle. I asked him if he'd ever worked 3 jobs simultaneously while dealing with probation requirements. I asked him if he'd ever had to choose between eating and keeping his phone turned on in case potential employers called. He didn't answer. I stood up to leave. I told them this was the last time I'd be meeting with any of them. I told them to stop calling me, stop texting me, stop showing up at my apartment or my workplace. I told them we were done being a family and that they needed to accept that. Grandma Catherine spoke then for the first time. She said I was making a terrible mistake. She said family was the most important thing in life, and that I'd realized that when I was old and alone, with nobody who cared about me. She said she'd made mistakes in her life too, but that she'd always valued family above everything else. She said I was going to end up bitter and lonely. I looked at her and said, at least I'd end up bitter and lonely, with a clear conscience about how I'd treated the people who were supposed to love me. I said I'd rather be alone than be surrounded by people who only cared about me when I was useful to them. I left the restaurant. Nobody followed me this time. That was 11 days ago. Since then, everything has played out exactly as I said it would. Grandma Catherine got her eviction notice. She's been staying with my parents temporarily, but that's creating tension because they're trying to figure out their own housing situation. Uncle Hank closed his business last week. Kyle got the notice about his property taxes, and he and Noah are in emergency meetings with their bank trying to work out a solution. My parents got their new rental agreement from the LLC, and they've been desperately trying to figure out where they can afford to live on their actual budget. The calls and texts have continued, but they're different now. They're not trying to negotiate anymore. They're not offering apologies or restitution. They're just begging. Literally begging me to reconsider, to show mercy, to give them a chance. Dad left me a voice message where he was actually crying, saying he was sorry, that he'd do anything to make this right, that he couldn't lose their house. Mom sent me a text at 3 a.m. saying, please, just please, she was sorry for everything. Maeve sent me a long message about how Mom wasn't sleeping, how Dad wasn't eating, how the stress was destroying them. Kyle sent me a message saying Noah was right about collateral damage and asking if I really wanted to hurt innocent people to get revenge on guilty ones. Yesterday, they all showed up at my apartment building again. Security called me before letting them in, but I told security to allow it. I went down to the lobby and there they were. All of them, looking exhausted and desperate. They said they needed me to understand what this was doing to them. Mom said she'd had a panic attack last week and ended up in the emergency room. Dad said he'd been having chest pains from stress. Maeve said she couldn't focus at work because she was so worried about everyone. Kyle said he and Noah were fighting constantly because of the financial pressure. Uncle Hank said he'd lost everything he'd built over 20 years. Grandma Catherine said she was scared about where she'd end up. They said they were sorry over and over again, that they'd do anything I wanted, that they'd spend the rest of their lives making it up to me if I just stopped this. They said, please, God, please make it stop. They couldn't take it anymore. They'd do anything. And you know what I felt watching them beg? Nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, no sympathy, just nothing. They'd broken something in me 5 years ago when they abandoned me, and it hadn't healed. It had hardened into something cold that couldn't be moved by their tears. I told them I'd already made my position clear. I told them this was the consequence of their choices. I told them they had created this situation by valuing reputation and comfort over their own family member, and now they were experiencing what it felt like to lose those things. Dad asked what he could do to change my mind. He said there had to be something, some way to fix this. He said he'd beg on his knees if that's what I wanted. I told him there was nothing he could do. I told him the time for fixing things was 5 years ago when I called from jail. I told him every decision they'd made since then had led directly to this moment. I told him that when he hung up that phone, when Mom sent that text, when Maeve made that Facebook post, when Kyle mocked me, when Uncle Hank lectured me, when Grandma Catherine turned her back, every single one of those moments was a choice they made. And now, they were living with the cumulative consequences of all those choices. Mom collapsed, like actually collapsed onto the lobby floor, sobbing that she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that she couldn't lose everything because of one mistake. I looked down at her and said it wasn't one mistake. It was hundreds of small decisions over 5 years to keep me out of their lives while they enjoyed their perfect family image. I walked back to the elevator and went up to my apartment. Security escorted them out of the building. So here's where everything stands now. My parents are moving out of their house next week. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment they can afford in a worse part of town. Grandma Catherine is going to live with them, which means 3 adults in a 2-bedroom apartment. Dad took a second job driving for a delivery service to help cover expenses. Mom is looking for work for the first time in 20 years. Kyle and Noah managed to work something out with their bank, but they're on a very tight budget now, and their marriage is strained. Kyle had to sell his car and buy something older. Noah stopped talking to the rest of the family because she blames them for the financial stress. Maeve has been the most persistent about trying to reach me, but her messages have changed from begging to angry. She sent me a message last week saying I'd gotten what I wanted, that I'd destroyed the family, and that I should be happy now. She said she hoped I enjoyed living alone with my revenge because it was all I had left. Uncle Hank declared bankruptcy. He's working for another construction company now as a regular employee instead of an owner. As for me, I got a promotion at work last month. I'm seeing someone casually, nothing serious yet. I joined a gym that has a basketball court and I've been playing pickup games on weekends. I bought a newer truck. Nothing fancy, but it's reliable. My apartment is quiet and I like it that way. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel satisfied either, exactly. I just feel like I finally balanced the scales. They took 5 years of my life where I had nothing and nobody. Now they get to experience what that's like. They took my sense of security and family. Now they don't have security or a functional family unit either. People in the comments keep asking if I'll ever forgive them or let them back into my life. The answer is no. They aren't my family anymore. They're just people I used to know who learned an expensive lesson about consequences. Maeve was right about one thing, though. This is all I have left from that relationship, but that's fine with me because what I have left is the knowledge that I'm not the failure they called me. I'm not the criminal they labeled me. I'm not the stain that wouldn't wash out. I'm the person who survived everything they did to me and then made them understand exactly what they'd done. When I walked out of that house on Christmas Eve, with snow melting on my shoes. I meant it when I whispered Merry Christmas. Because that was the moment I gave them the gift I'd been preparing for 5 years. The gift of consequences. They're sorry now. They're devastated now. They're begging now. But they weren't sorry when it mattered. And that's something they're going to have to live with for the rest of their lives. Just like I've had to live with being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally.